Hi guys, it's me, CHD, and welcome to another episode of the podcast where today we are going to be reviewing the Las Vegas Grand Prix of 2024 where, of course, the Drivers' Championship has finally been decided for the year, and of course get into everything that happened in the Grand Prix, go through the top teams' performances, obviously have a look at the championship standings as well. First thing that I want to get into quickly is an apology for obviously not doing the race watch along on Sunday morning, but it was out of my control. The satellite TV signal for my Skybox just wasn't working, and it was because of the storm we had in the UK on Saturday, which continued into the early hours of Sunday. Yeah, it was so bad that my satellite was dropping out every couple of seconds. So, you know, obviously for a watch along, I have to be able to watch the session with you guys, and for me to, commentate on it, I have to, again, be able to watch the session, and I couldn't. It was literally unwatchable, which is why I had to go to sleep and then wake up later when the weather had calmed down to actually re-watch the race on Sky F1, and a bit online as well, because I'd missed certain parts of the race. So, yeah, apologies about that, but there was nothing I could do. It was that's just the way things happened, unfortunately. It was a shame because I was really looking forward to doing the race watch along, given how mixed up the grid was. But we had the race, and it was not as good as last year's Las Vegas Grand Prix, but it was a decent race. It was probably a 7 out of 10 type of Grand Prix. Good, but not great. But, given that we didn't have any safety cars, I think that's probably as good of a race as it was going to be in Vegas, given the pace of certain cars. But let's go through the race results from the Las Vegas Grand Prix and your finishing top 10. George Russell winning in Vegas, his second win of the season, thoroughly deserved for Mercedes-Benz. Lewis Hamilton finishing in second, coming from 10th on the grid. If only he did not mess up qualifying, he probably would have won the race. Third, Carlos Sainz. Fourth, Charles Leclerc. Fifth, Max Verstappen. And with Max Verstappen fifth and Lando Norris, his main championship rival, finishing in sixth, Max Verstappen is officially the Drivers' World Champion of 2024. And that is 4 championships in a row for Max Verstappen. Just incredible. And he is, as we'll get onto probably in a later video, Max is clearly the best driver on the grid. No doubt about that. And he has been absolutely the best driver of 2024. Lando Norris 6th, Oscar Piastri then in 7th place, with Hülkenberg in 8th, Tsunoda in 9th, and Sergio Perez finishing in P10. Another poor race for Perez as Red Bull slipping away quite clearly in the Constructors' Championship. Obviously, I'll show the standings on screen later on, but yeah, was a decent race. But let's get into the teams, and we'll start, of course, with the race winners, Mercedes-Benz, who never looked like losing this Grand Prix from the minute the weekend began. They had the pace all weekend. The only shame, I guess, for Mercedes, for Mercedes, but from our point of view, is that Lewis Hamilton had his poor qualifying, because we could have got a really good inter-team fight for the race win between Hamilton and Russell in the race on Sunday, but Lewis Hamilton screwed up his qualifying. For George Russell, brilliant weekend. Very similar weekend to what he did back when he was in Formula 2, where, of course, he dominated that championship. Getting pole, having a great start. And even though there was some slight trouble early on with a plastic bag, I think, attached to the floor of his car that was hurting his pace, once that was removed, he flew off into the distance, and there was no catching him, really, for the race win after that. Again, similar to his Formula 2 season, where he did that so many times. And yeah, thoroughly deserving, Russell, of the race victory. And with Lewis Hamilton, Lewis was, I would say, driver of the day. But I struggle to sit here and feel sorry for Lewis Hamilton in terms of him not being able to get the win, because at the end of the day, it was his own fault when it comes to that. If he had actually delivered a decent qualifying lap, maybe, yeah, he wins the race on Sunday. I mean, if he had did his Q2 time in Q3, I think he would have ended up third on the grid or something like that. So, at the end of the day, as to why he didn't win, it's his fault. But still, at a great drive coming back from 10th to 2nd. Mercedes were clearly the fastest team, so that did obviously help. But some of the overtakes he pulled off were very, very good. So, yeah, great performance by Lewis Hamilton. But again, I do struggle to feel sorry for him in terms of not getting, what would have been pretty much his final win for Mercedes, because he just didn't deliver in qualifying when George Russell did. And that is why, the biggest reason why, George Russell has been better, clearly better than Lewis Hamilton in 2024. And I am happy that Russell is ahead of Hamilton now in the championship and is starting to pull away, because, I mean, I don't really like Russell more than Hamilton necessarily, but I like to see that a driver more deserving of being ahead in the championship is actually going to be ahead in the championship. And Russell deserves to be ahead of Lewis Hamilton in the championship because he has been better this season. Clearly better this season. So yeah, great drive from Russell. Great day for Mercedes in what is likely to be their final race win of 2024. And that would be what? How many race wins? 4 race wins for 2024, which is a lot more wins this year than we thought at the start of this year they would be getting. So, they've recovered nicely in 2024, but still a lot of work to do if next year they're going to have anything like a championship winning car. But now we'll go on to, I think, Ferrari next, quickly, because they had a very topsy-turvy and just unusual race. First off, Charles Leclerc, what a fantastic start from him, going up the inside at turn 1, which gave him the preferred line then for the following couple corners, and he was able to pass Gasly and his teammate Sainz. Had a right go at passing Russell. Russell was affected by a plastic bag though, so I'm not sure how genuine it was really in terms of the pace Leclerc had. And then Leclerc clearly destroyed his tyres trying to fight Russell and catch Russell. Literally, his tyres and his pace fell off a cliff. He was lapping so slowly in that final couple laps before his first pit stop. I remember after Verstappen passed him in that first stint, Leclerc dropped like 3 seconds in one lap. That's how bad it was. So, yeah. It was a very mixed bag with Leclerc in that first stint of the race. Carlos Sainz, towards the end of the first stint, had obviously a better stint than Leclerc. They both ended up pitting, and it didn't quite work out in the second stint in terms of them against Max Verstappen, who really, the reason he was ahead of the two Ferraris was because in the first stint, the Red Bull just had much better tyre life, which allowed Max Verstappen to get past both Ferraris and then stay ahead. So Ferrari weren't exactly looking great at that stage, but then at the end of the second stint, Carlos Sainz then started to have the exact issues that Leclerc had, and then Ferrari made the right decision to tell Carlos to let Leclerc through because Carlos was really slow. And then Carlos decided to come in, and then the team told him to stay out, and at the very last minute, and I mean very last minute, he stayed out and cut back onto the track. I don't know how he didn't get a penalty for that, but I guess he did not technically break any regulations there. That was a mental situation. And then Leclerc stayed out for a few laps. His pace was decent. It wasn't, that bad considering he stayed out for a few laps longer. Then he came in, and then Carlos Sainz, who I think was told to not fight Leclerc when Leclerc came out, passed Leclerc straight away as soon as he could. And then after that, Leclerc just never really seemed to get after Sainz and get after the race after that, which I'm baffled by. Now, I know Leclerc after the race came out and was, moaning about team orders and, what Carlos did and all of that. But what I don't get is, why did Leclerc have no pace compared to his teammate when he had a few lap fresher tyres? We saw through the race, fresher tyres was a big advantage. Look at Nico Hülkenberg. Every time he pitted, his fresh tyres carried him, right back into the top 10. And eventually, Hülkenberg finished in 8th place. But for some reason with Leclerc, I don't know if it was because he was so angry with what Carlos did or miserable, but he just had no pace. And Carlos ended up taking the podium. So I don't understand what was going on there. In terms of, were Ferrari right to call team orders on Sainz? I think at the time, yes, they probably were right to tell Carlos not to fight Leclerc, because they probably expected Leclerc to have a bit more pace than Carlos, given Leclerc would have had fresher tyres. But that's not how it turned out. So in hindsight, Ferrari were wrong. But I think at the time, Ferrari were right to tell Carlos not to fight Leclerc. But with how it all turned out, I think it was all okay in the end. But yeah, just a very weird situation. I mean, 3rd and 4th for Ferrari is, even though Lewis Hamilton came out from 10th on the grid, I think realistically 3rd and 4th is the best result Ferrari could have got. Ferrari had good pace. It wasn't race-winning pace, but they had good pace. The issue is they just kept burning their tyres out a little earlier than the other teams around them were, which is something they still are guilty of. We saw that in Mexico with Leclerc against Norris in the late part of that race, where Leclerc's tyres fell away. That was just the main issue for Ferrari. They just kept burning their tyres out and having to pit probably 2 to 3 laps earlier, really, than I think they were ideally wanting to, but that's just how it played out. But overall for the team, 3rd and 4th, again, is the best result really they could have got. And that is, 27 points. McLaren only scored 15. So they've gained on McLaren a bit, but not maybe by quite enough. Not maybe by as much as they would have hoped from this Grand Prix, given that coming into the Grand Prix weekend, I think a lot of us thought Ferrari would have the best car here, but just didn't turn out to be the case. But, couple races to go, including a sprint race in Qatar. It's still up for grabs, but I still think McLaren definitely are the favourites, because McLaren, theoretically, should have the best car for the final 2 tracks, given the characteristics of those 2 tracks and the layout of those 2 tracks in Qatar and Abu Dhabi. So we'll see how it plays out. But as we have seen, as of late, just because we think a certain team's going to be quick doesn't mean that actually turns out to be the case, as we'll get on to with McLaren later. Quickly, before we go on to McLaren, though, of course, we must go to Red Bull Racing and serenade our world champion Max Verstappen. What a fantastic season from him. Clearly the deserving champion of 2024. I don't think anyone would debate that. He's been clearly better than Lando Norris, even though Lando has had a faster car probably since, say, the Spanish Grand Prix up until pretty much around now. I think Lando and McLaren have had the better car, but Max still has ended up winning the championship relatively comfortably. And it just shows you again how great Verstappen is, remaining consistent despite how bad things got in certain races back, Monza, for example, where the Red Bull was undrivable and he ended up 6th, miles behind, McLaren and Ferrari. Baku, of course, getting beat by Norris, even though Norris started near at the back of the grid. Things got pretty bad, but he kept with it. He stayed consistent, and I think he knew mentally that as long as he did that, he would be fine, because Lando Norris was very much inconsistent through 2024, and that's a big reason why Lando Norris did not win the championship. By the way, if you can hear background noise, it's just a plane going over my house. So Verstappen, that's really why he won this championship. It wasn't because he won an absolute shit ton of races. It was because he was the most consistent. And one thing I do want to quickly dispel, which I saw Karun Chandhok from Sky F1 say about a week ago, Max Verstappen did not win the championship because of Red Bull's early form. That's not why he won the championship. Karun came out and said that he thinks, the reason Lando lost the championship was because in those first few races up until Miami, where Red Bull clearly had the best car, Max obviously won, I think, he won 4 of the first 5 races, which obviously did give him an advantage to start with. But if you actually look at the championship standings after the Miami Grand Prix, when McLaren improved and Lando Norris took his first ever win, the gap was shorter after Miami than it is now. So we can't sit here and say, but the only reason Max won the championship is because Red Bull had the best car in the first 5 races by an absolute mile. That is not true. That is to the point of gaslighting, really, from Karun in terms of, when it comes to looking back at this season. That is just not the case at all. And I just don't see how he can possibly have that viewpoint when it is, I think, almost pretty much factually incorrect, again, given that Lando was closer to Max after his win in Miami than he is now. And yet McLaren have had a faster car than Red Bull since that Miami Grand Prix, pretty much. So how can you possibly say, it's Max won the championship because of the first 5 races? That is complete bullshit. And I think he knows it to a degree. Max, like I said, clearly the best driver of the season, thoroughly deserving of being champion. Can he win 5 in a row next year? It's going to be tough because Red Bull are not likely at this point, if you just look at where they are now and where they're likely to be probably at the start of next season, Red Bull are not likely to have the best car next season. It's more likely to be maybe McLaren or even Ferrari, I would say, next season look more likely, given just how much worse Red Bull have got through the season, and there's no evidence that Red Bull are just suddenly going to bounce back to the form of last year, for example, where they're winning every single Grand Prix. So it's going to be very tough if Max is going to win the championship next year. But one thing I will say is if he does not have the fastest car next year and he wins the championship again, then I think we are looking at absolutely one of the best drivers of all time. Absolutely, if he wins the championship next year. This year definitely helps him a lot in his case all time to where he sits, amongst the all-time great drivers. I still personally, I'm not going to put him up there with Hamilton, Senna and Schumacher because I don't think he has done quite enough yet, even though he's had loads and loads of race wins. If you look at the championships he's won, not all of them have been maybe as impressive as, say, some of the championships Hamilton won or Schumacher won. We have to remember 2022 and 2023 was, I think, those championships were more so won for reasons other than Max, whether it was Red Bull having a really good car, or in 2022, Ferrari just being a complete joke. And then obviously 2021, even though I think Max was better than Lewis Hamilton that season, Max did win it in really bad circumstances in terms of the rules. So we cannot deny these things. But this season, like I said, it does help his case massively as to where he sits all time. But I personally, at this current point, I would not put Max in my all-time top 5. I think probably I would more likely put him at the highest, probably around 7th, 8th, probably around there. Is the highest I would put him right now. But like I said, if he can win the championship next year and still not have the fastest car, then I probably would then put him in my top 5 all time. But we will see what the future holds for Max Verstappen. Next year might even be his final year as a Red Bull driver. We will find out. Hopefully, with Sergio Perez, this last couple races is his final as a Red Bull driver, because he, again, was diabolical in Las Vegas. Let's finally, though, go on to McLaren. They had, in terms of performance, that was probably the worst Grand Prix of the season for them. That was, from what I can remember, that was one of the only races this season where they were the slowest of the top 4 teams. The only other race I could think of where they were that slow was maybe Bahrain, which was obviously the first race of the season. I can't think of any other race where they were the 4th best team, and they were clearly the 4th best team. They were nowhere near Mercedes. They were lapping like 3/4 of a second off the pace per lap than Mercedes. Even Red Bull were clearly quicker than them by, probably 2-3 tenths of a second per lap. Something that, given Red Bull had those rear wing issues to start the weekend, I didn't think was possible. But that's how it happened. So yeah, I'm very concerned about McLaren because, this could be just a one-off. Maybe in Qatar they'll return and be super, super quick. But McLaren, if they're going to win the Constructors' Championship, they just simply have to deliver on the performance we're expecting from them in these final couple races. If you look at the track layout of Qatar, the Qatar track, the Lusail circuit is, and then the final circuit of, was it Yas Marina? I think it is, the Abu Dhabi track. If you look at those circuits, they are textbook McLaren tracks. High-speed corners, very important that you have, very good aero package. That is just, those are McLaren circuits, especially the Lusail track in Qatar. So if they don't deliver the performance we're expecting, they could lose this Constructors' Championship because they're not that far ahead still. And their 2 drivers are not performing to standard. Oscar Piastri has not really had a good race weekend since his win in Baku. Lando Norris is inconsistent as ever. And, this weekend he was consistent, but he was consistently 6th in both qualifying and the race, which, there was nothing he could do about it. McLaren were just, that's how quick they were. 6th and 7th is, they couldn't have done any better than that at the end of the day. But they really have to deliver on these final couple races, because if they lose the Constructors' Championship to Ferrari, the psychological blow that will have going into next year will be absolutely massive and way bigger than they will pretend to the media. Because, we have seen it before where a team has failed to win the Drivers' Championship, and then even, despite being in a good position, the Constructors still somehow failed to win the Constructors' Championship. I remember, even though I wasn't watching at the time, Williams in 2003, they were looking very good for the Drivers' Championship, really close with Michael Schumacher and Montoya, with Raikkonen obviously in there as well, in the McLaren. Montoya obviously lost the championship of the penultimate race, but the Constructors were still on going into those final couple races, and then Williams just completely fell apart and ended up somehow losing it to Ferrari when it looked more likely that Williams would win it. And then going into the following season, Williams were just absolutely nowhere, which, that wasn't necessarily because of the psychological blow of 2003, but it absolutely played a role in why, in 2004, they dropped off massively. So what I'm saying is, they've got to win this Constructors' Championship, because not just from what I've said, but also, you never know when the next chance to win a Constructors' Championship may be. This might be, if they don't win it this year, they might not have another chance for another 10 years. You don't know. You really don't know. Formula One changes all the time. I mean, look, this time last year, Red Bull, winning every single race pretty much, winning the constructors by a gazillion points. And now a year later, Red Bull are heading for third in the championship. Absolutely nobody predicted that for 2024. That's how quickly things can change in Formula One. So even though McLaren look great now and are in the lead of the constructors, if they don't win the constructors this year, there's, we can't just sit here and say, oh, well, they'll definitely win it next year. Because next year, who knows? They might not have a good enough car. They might end up third, fourth in the constructors. You just don't know in Formula One when another chance is going to come up. So they've got to deliver in these final couple races. And if they do, and if both drivers perform to standard and the car does perform as expected, then they should win the Constructors' Championship. But if they do not deliver the performance that I think is clearly there to be found, and the two drivers don't just drive well enough, then Ferrari will pick up the pieces. Because even though Ferrari are not, they're not consistently winning race in, race out, both drivers are performing consistently, and they are consistently scoring quite a lot of points, are Ferrari. And they will absolutely pick up the pieces if there's anything to pick up. So McLaren got to deliver. I can't really moan too much about the two drivers' performances because McLaren, like I said, they just weren't quick. They were quite clearly the fourth best team. Let's hope, from their point of view, they get back to what they should be doing in Qatar, which really is getting pole and winning the race. And given how quick Piastri was in Qatar last year, really, I think McLaren should be aiming for a front row lockout and a 1-2 finish this weekend in Qatar. And if they get that, then that pretty much wraps up the Constructors' Championship. So, yeah, McLaren have got to aim for that. But those are the top teams. Shout out to Nico Hulkenberg. Good result for him and Haas. Haas now back up to 6th in the championship. Good drive from Yuki Tsunoda as well, finishing in 9th place. I do want to shout out also Pierre Gasly, because even though he had his engine problem, what a qualifying he had and what a weekend he had up until the problem he had in the race. Pierre Gasly continuing to show that even though his car has been pretty bad at times, he has had, I think, a pretty good season himself. He just hasn't been able to show a lot of what he can do because, again, the car has just not been there for him. And for Ocon as well, we have to, of course, remember. But yeah, Pierre Gasly shout out, obviously third on the grid at Alpine is, quite a surprising result. But yeah, that is your Las Vegas Grand Prix. One bit of good news, it's not confirmed, but one bit of good news that should be confirmed soon that I've seen is that looks like General Motors are going to be on the grid in 2026. Not necessarily with their own power unit, that will come later, but looks like we are going to have an 11th Formula One team being, I think Cadillac F1 is the team name that we're hearing in the media. That's great news, and I really hope we get confirmation of that soon. And that team should be on the grid then for 2026, with Ferrari, it sounds like, are going to be the ones supplying that team until General Motors come up with their power unit, which we believe will be coming in 2028. So that is fantastic news that came out over the Las Vegas Grand Prix weekend. But that is your Las Vegas Grand Prix podcast review. Just want to quickly let you guys know of what the content plan is for this weekend's Qatar Grand Prix. I will be live for both qualifying and the race, of course, as long as the weather doesn't get in the way. Qualifying, I'll be live at 4:30 p.m. UK time on Saturday to build up to qualifying, and then, of course, do a watch-along of the session. And then on Sunday, the 1st of December, that's this Sunday, I will be live at 2 p.m. UK time, 2 hours before lights out, to do the build-up to the race and then a watch-along for the race. Nib, my co-commentator, will maybe be joining us. We'll have to see. He definitely will be joining us for the final race a week after this Grand Prix, obviously for the final time in Abu Dhabi. But yeah, for Qatar, we'll have to see whether he can join us or not. But yeah, I will be live for both qualifying and the race. And then, of course, the day after the Qatar Grand Prix, there'll be a podcast reviewing the events of the Qatar Grand Prix. And then for Abu Dhabi, exactly the same. I'll be live for both qualifying and the race, and then a podcast review the final race, which I'll probably upload on Sunday night instead of Monday, just so I can get out of the way. Because then obviously after the final race, we need to get into end of season stuff. But yeah, thank you guys for coming along for this podcast. Make sure to smash a like button before you go and comment below what you thought of the Las Vegas Grand Prix of 2024. But until my qualifying watch along this Saturday at 4:30 p.m. UK time to cover a very important qualifying session when it comes to the destination of the Constructors' Championship, it has been me, Chazza HD. Goodbye.